The Fokker D.XXI is a low-tier premium in War Thunder. Let's check it out. In the mid-1930s, the Netherlands recognized a need to add some updated designs to their Air Force, and right around the same time, the Fokker company had submitted a few unsolicited aircraft proposals to the military leadership. The timing ended up being very convenient, and funding was provided to construct a prototype for a new single-engine fighter. The new design was fairly conventional for the times, and featured a radial engine driving a 3-bladed propeller, fixed landing gear, and low-caliber armament. This was a low-winged monoplane with an enclosed cockpit, which represented the new vogue in fighter design, and initial testing showed potential. However, politics happened, and funding was briefly shifted to bomber development, which slowed the project down by over a year, before a small production batch was finally approved in 1937. The final design was designated D.XXI and attracted interest from a few export customers, including Finland, which probably saved the project from cancellation. As the Second World War heated up, the D.XXI found itself in combat, and in Dutch service, it did manage to score a few victories before the Dutch surrender. Meanwhile, Finland used the D.XXI with at least some level of success during the Winter War against the Soviet Union, and again during the Continuation War. According to most primary sources, the plane managed to maintain a positive win-loss ratio in air combat. However, by mid-1943, it was basically obsolete, and it started being phased out of frontline combat service. Even still, they were still used in secondary roles by Finland all the way until 1949. The D.XXI was the last single-engine fighter produced by the Fokker company and represented the end of the line for a series of single-engine fighters going all the way back to some of the best aircraft of the First World War. What we're looking at in War Thunder is the Fokker D.XXI, a premium fighter in Rank 2 of the Swedish tech tree with a battle rating of 2.0. There's also a D.XXI in the tech tree, which is broadly similar, but has different weapons, and most of this review also applies to that aircraft. This plane's armament is a pair of 20mm cannons along with a pair of 7.7mm machine guns. The cannon ammo is limited, but in general this is a really hard-hitting set of weapons for this low of a battle rating. The machine guns have a very high rate of fire, about 1,600 rounds per minute, which is really strong for low tier, while the cannons have a much slower rate of fire, as you would expect. You get a fairly good selection of ammo belts for both pairs of guns, with the stealth belt being objectively the most powerful for attacking aircraft at the expense of being a little more difficult to aim. The universal belts are also both reasonably effective if you want to add some tracers without losing too much punch. Though if you're planning to go out as close air support or something, consider the ground targets belt for the cannon, which has more armor penetrating rounds. Being a small and lightweight fighter, the D.XXI doesn't get any external weapons. The flight performance of the D.XXI is a mixed bag, and it has a lot of quirks. The first thing to say is that this plane is pretty slow. It maxes out just a tiny bit over 400 kilometers an hour in level flight, but the low maximum speed is mostly just the result of parasite drag from the fixed landing gear and the cannons out on the wings. Despite its low speed, the plane really doesn't feel underpowered at all, and in fact, it actually has a really good rate of climb for a low-tier aircraft, and if you're patient, it's really not much of a challenge to get and keep an altitude advantage early in a match. However, the low top speed and average acceleration mean that most opponents can run away from you if they want, and you really can't disengage if you're being attacked in most circumstances. Now, the good news is that the D.XXI is a fairly agile plane, and it's fully aerobatic if you keep the speed over about 250 kilometers an hour or so. If you're careful with your air combat maneuvering, the D.XXI can outturn a significant number of the other planes at this BR in a raw rate fight. And also keep in mind that this plane has a very effective rudder, almost as good as biplane fighters. So if you're in a rate turn and it's not going well, you can just cut hard into the rudder and swing underneath to pull up on your opponents, just like you could in a biplane. That trick still works in the D.XXI. this plane doesn't get combat flaps, and its landing flaps rip at a pretty low speed, so they're not really of any use in normal flight. However, the plane is surprisingly sturdy, and you really won't run into any wing rip issues until over 700 kilometers an hour, which you're really not going to hit unless you go into a straight dive. Speaking of which, the plane ends up being really good for diving and vulture tactics, mostly because of that high rip speed. Plus, up at high altitude, its lightweight helps it retain most of its agility, and it can actually win a turn fight up above 5,000 meters if you somehow manage to find yourself in a dogfight up that high. Taking the D.XXI out into air battles offers you some options that you don't always get at this BR range. Its great climb performance means that if you want, you can go up and look for bombers with your cannons. You can climb and get in a position for boom and zoom vulture stuff, or you can go up to escort your team's bombers. Of course, if you prefer to go right into the enemy team at medium or low altitude for traditional dogfighting, the D.XXI won't let you down. With this plane's strong agility, most one-on-one fights are going to be winnable, and with its reasonably strong firepower for this BR, it's usually not too difficult to take down opponents in a one-on-one. In realistic battles of this BR with a plane this slow, you're going to end up spending a significant amount of your time just trying to find some combat. It really won't be uncommon to just spend like 2 or 3 minutes flying in a straight line between engagements. And personally, I find this sort of action, sleep, slow-paced gameplay to be pretty painful. So, like a lot of other players, I usually opt for arcade battles at BR this low, just to keep things interesting. Now, if you do go out into arcade battles, don't hesitate to use the D.XXI very aggressively. The arcade battle footage I used in this review wasn't cherry-picked. If your air combat maneuvering is decent, you can just fly this thing around right into some pretty thick fighting and go nuts with the 20mm cannons, racking up some really impressive kill counts. In terms of ground attack, the cannons are capable of taking out light tanks and stuff with the AP belts. Just keep in mind that the ammo is limited. I personally prefer to use this plane as primarily air cover when I fly out over a ground battle, and frankly, flying out over a ground RB match at this low of a tier can be much faster paced for air combat than a regular air RB match would be, just due to the smaller map size, so something to think about. Visually, I think this is a neat looking plane, and it kind of reminds me of some interwar air racers. You can get a couple of paint jobs for it, but for some reason, the Dutch skin looks like dirty or something. I don't care for it. Overall though, it's still an okay looking plane. Landing the D.XXI couldn't be simpler. You throw out landing flaps at about 225 kilometers an hour, and the fixed landing gear is pretty robust. Just slow down and touch down. I didn't run into any nose-over issues locking up the brakes. The cockpit on this plane offers great visibility, but I personally found the gun sight a little awkward in VR. Not sure why, it just never lined up quite right for me. Plus, the scope zoom is really disorienting. But on the upside, the instruments are all easy to find, and the visibility is still good. Overall, it's a pretty average cockpit for a low-tier fighter. To close out on the Fokker D.XXI. This plane has a good rate of climb, it's highly agile, has pretty good firepower, and it gets premium bonuses. However, it's painfully slow, has no external weapons, and doesn't get combat flaps. The final verdict on the D.XXI is that this is actually one of my favorite low-tier premiums. It's reasonably effective in combat, and it's pretty fun to fly. As always, thanks for watching.